Hello and welcome back, hopefully to our last lecture in our discussion of nutrition and metabolism. And so we were talking about energy balance, that caloric intake equals calories burned leads to a constant weight. And so we were talking about how appetite control, appetite is our desire to seek food, amount of restraint we have is our self-control, and then food availability determines our caloric intake. Our calories burned, or our total energy expenditure, is going to be a combination of our basal metabolic rate, which is about 60 to 75%, the cost of our physical activity, and of course time and intensity is going to increase that caloric burn. And then there's something called diet-induced thermogenesis, and that's that heat created due to the types of food that cost for digesting certain types of food and processing certain types of food. And so I gave you the sad news that diet can't really change your basal metabolic rate, other than if you have more lean muscle mass and if you're not starving yourself. Those things have a play on basal metabolic rate. And then too, you can play just a little bit with the types of food that you're consuming as far as that diet-induced thermogenesis. And so one of the major problems in healthcare and in our country and other countries around the world is obesity. And so that's where we have the most common nutritional disorders involve caloric imbalances, particularly obesity. And so this is an excellent done TED Talk on that subject.
The most basic function of bodily fat is self-storage of food reserves. In prehistoric times, natural selection favored genotypes that could endure harsh conditions by stocking the most fat. With chronic malnutrition being the norm for most of human history, genetics evolved to favor fat storage. So when did body fat become problematic? The negative impacts of being overweight were not even noted in medical literature until as late as the 18th century. Then, technological advances coupled with public health measures resulted in the betterment of the quantity, quality, and variety of food. Sustained abundance of good food enabled a healthier population to boom economically. Output increased, and with it, leisure time and waistlines. By the mid-19th century, being excessively overweight, or obese, was recognized as a cause of ill health, and another century later declared deadly. What is the distinction between being overweight and being obese? A calculation called the BMI breaks it down for us. For example, if someone weighs 65 kilograms and is 1.5 meters tall, they have a BMI of about 29. Obesity is a condition of excess body fat that occurs when a person's BMI is above 30, just over the overweight range of 25 to 29.9. While BMI can be a helpful estimate of healthy weight, actual body fat percentage can only really be determined by also considering information like waist circumference and muscle mass. Athletes, for instance, have a naturally higher BMI. So how does a person become obese? At its most basic, obesity is caused by energy imbalance. If the energy input from calories is greater than the energy output from physical activity, the body stores the extra calories as fat. In most cases, this imbalance comes from a combination of circumstances and choices. Adults should be getting at least 2.5 hours of exercise each week, and children a whole hour per day. But globally, 1 in 4 adults and 8 out of 10 adolescents aren't active enough. Calorie-dense processed foods and growing portion sizes, coupled with pervasive marketing, lead to passive overeating. And scarce resources and a lack of access to healthy, affordable foods creates an even greater risk in disadvantaged communities. Yet our genetic makeup also plays a part. Studies on families and on separated twins have shown a clear causal hereditary relationship to weight gain. Recent studies have also found a link between obesity and variations in the bacteria species that live in our digestive systems. No matter the cause, obesity is an escalating global epidemic. it substantially raises the probability of diseases like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, and cancer. It affects virtually all ages, genders, and socioeconomic groups in both developed and developing countries. With a 60% rise in child obesity globally over just 2 decades, the problem is too significant to ignore. Once a person is obese, the climb to recovery becomes progressively steeper. Hormonal and metabolic changes reduce the body's response to overeating. After losing weight, a formerly overweight person burns less calories doing the same exercises as a person who is naturally the same weight, making it much more difficult to shed the excess fat. And as people gain weight, damage to signaling pathways makes it increasingly difficult for the brain to measure food intake and fat storage. There is, however, some evidence that well-monitored, long-term changes in behavior can lead to improvements in obesity-related health issues. And weight loss from sustained lifestyle changes or invasive treatments like bariatric surgery can improve insulin resistance and decrease inflammation. What was once an advantage for survival is now working against us. As the world's population continues to slow down and get bigger, moving and consciously eating our way towards a healthier weight is essential to our overall well-being. And with the epidemic affecting every country in the world for different socioeconomic reasons, obesity cannot be seen as an isolated issue. More global measures for prevention are essential to manage the weight of the world.
Okay, so I don't know if you've ever thought of obesity in the terms of evolution, but yes, the people that are on the earth today have ancestors that survived hardship and scarcity, and so it's sort of understandable that particularly some people more than others have metabolism that is going to cause them to conserve energy and also to store fat. But anyway, if we were together, we'd have a great discussion about it. So body mass index, like I said, that's just sort of what's used today to assess weight, considering height. And so they have these sort of body mass index tables. And so underweight is classified as a BMI below 18. Normal weight is a BMI from 19 to 24. Overweight, 25 to 30. And over 30 is considered to be obese. So just like that TED Talk we just watched about obesity, obesity is more correctly defined as excess adipose tissue. And so for males, obesity would be excess of 25% fat, and then for females it would be excess of 32% fat. And that difference has to do with testosterone actually causes that muscle development and lipolysis, whereas estrogen causes women to store fat. So that's why you get those differences there. But you can have an athlete and someone who's not athletic having the same BMI. So it's just better if someone can measure adipose tissue or percent fat. There we go. So we are at a unique place in history in that there have never been obese children before. So 1/3 of adults in the United States are obese and 1/5 of our children, which, like I said, this has never occurred before. They know that, just like what we watched, is that being obese messes with chemical signaling in the brain and alters metabolism. And so we really don't know what's going to happen to these obese children because it's never occurred. We know that obesity increases chance of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, stroke, certain cancers. We talked about gallbladder disease and gallstones, respiratory disease. You get apnea. And then, too, it also causes menstrual irregularities. It is a very complex problem. So, yes, there's heredity, there's environment, and then, too, obesity just affects some groups more than others. So looking at this, just in case you're wondering, Texas is not the fattest state. We are number 14. This is from 2017. 1/3 of our adults are obese. If you go over here looking at age groups, the biggest age group would be mine, so 45 to 64. If you look at it demographically, it also is not quite evenly distributed. So they have blacks and Latinos having higher rates than the white population, and if Asian were on here, they are lower than those four groups. And then men are just slightly more obese than women. And so just kind of showing you it doesn't hit all people groups the same. And two, there's that correlation because of food availability and cost of those processed foods. The fattier foods and the sugar-laden foods are the cheaper foods. So, and then to go into any fast food place, the salad's going to be $7, but yet you can buy that cheeseburger for $1. And so these are just, it's a complex issue, and that's why it's not evenly distributed. Treatment, of course, the obvious negative energy balance and behavior lifestyle modifications. Like I said, we have a very deep relationship with food, so you can't just tell somebody, hey, move more, eat less. It's definitely going to take that behavior and lifestyle modification. There are certain drugs that can help suppress appetite or even suppress fat absorption. And then we kind of already talked about the gastric bypass, but you can also have gastric banding is another one. All right, so let's talk about types of malnutrition. So basically primary and secondary. So malnutrition, so that prefix mal means bad. So poor nutrition that results from a lack of essential nutrients or the inability to use them. So when someone has primary malnutrition, that means it has to do with their diet. So their dietary intake, so either too much, too little, or they're eating the wrong stuff. So you can have undernutrition, so you have a deficiency of those essential nutrients, or you can have overnutrition where you're having that excess of nutrient intake. But we know when someone is malnourished, it's going to have an effect on energy. You're going to get muscle wasting, increased fractures, just basically disease, increased risk of hospitalization, falls, reduced mobility, and then can affect your moods, and also affects the immune system, so increase of infection. So we know it's not good to be malnourished. Another type of malnutrition that you're going to run into clinically, this is secondary malnutrition. And so this has nothing to do with the diet, but basically individual characteristics or disease states makes that diet insufficient. And so there are some diseases that increase nutrient needs. Some cancers actually, in response to tumors, the body will raise the basal metabolic rate. So that's where you get cachexia, which is that wasting syndrome, that extreme weight loss that you see in cancer, that muscle wasting, so any chronic disease. Also the end stages of AIDS, emphysema because it takes so much energy for them to breathe. So increased nutrient needs because of a disease, not because of their diet. Increased loss of nutrients, so things like Crohn's disease, that irritable bowel syndrome, just so that's an autoimmune disease where the intestine are being attacked, and so irritable bowel, so yeah, frequent bouts of diarrhea. Someone can have pernicious anemia, so that lack of intrinsic factor, they can't absorb B12, or they can't absorb iron for other reasons, or two, cystic fibrosis leads to a blockage of the pancreatic duct, so you don't get adequate digestion or absorption. So that's what's called secondary malnutrition. So your patient's disease state will affect their amount of nutrition. Of course, there's starvation. I don't know if you watched the show Naked and Afraid. I have it recorded, and so yeah, during this time at home, I've been watching a bit of Naked and Afraid. But a healthy human can survive about 50 to 70 days without food. Totally needs the water. But that starvation, just overall lack of nutrients, is Marasmus. We talked about Kwashiorkor, that protein starvation. But yeah, so symptoms of starvation: low blood pressure, slow pulse, chills, dry skin, hair loss, poor immunity, clearly. Eating disorders, anorexia, nervosis, that's self-starvation. And then bulimia, that's that binging and purging. So those are just all examples of starvation. All right, so if you are losing steam, I kind of need you to take a little break. You can pause me, but I'm going to keep going. So this is in your notes, and this is one of our primary objectives, so you understand what happens when the body's in the fed state or the body's in the fasting state. So whether we're absorbing nutrients or whether we're post-absorptive state. And so that's where we're headed. So this right here, I need you to understand this. And that's what I'm going to test you on. So let's go through it. All right, so just some understanding. So catabolic-anabolic steady state. So sometimes we're building, sometimes we're burning. And so this is like a dynamic state in which organic molecules, except DNA, are continuously being broken down and rebuilt. The body uses nutrient pools, so there's stores of amino acids, carbohydrates, and fats. And I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. Pathways are interconvertible. And so we have a lot of links between common intermediates between our metabolic pathways. The amount and direction of conversion, our big players are going to be liver, adipose tissue, and skeletal muscle. So this was a picture. So you see a lot of arrows going both ways. And so, like I said, we can break things down to make ATP, or we can have building reactions. And so we have catabolism, and we have anabolism, and a lot of those intermediates can go both ways. So there is some flexibility there. And the body's going to control this to meet body needs during different nutritional states. One thing about amino acid pool, that's the body's total supply of free amino acids, so amino acids that aren't being used in proteins. We lose protein daily in urine, our hair falls out, skin cells. Typically, we have to replace this by a diet. So that pool of amino acids, we're going to make body proteins that we lose. We can form amino acid derivatives. And then, two, we can use amino acids to make glucose, so gluconeogenesis. We don't really save them for later like we store adipose tissue or we store glycogen. All right, so carbohydrates and fat pools. Carbohydrates and fats are easily interconverted through key intermediates. The major difference between carbohydrates and fat pools and amino acid pool is that fats and carbohydrates, they're oxidized directly to produce energy. Amino acids, we're going to cleave off that amino group, so we get that formation of urea because we're going to make a keto acid, and then we can put it in a citric acid cycle and metabolize it for energy. Excess carbohydrates and fats can be stored as glycogen or as adipose tissue, but the amino acids are never stored as protein, so we don't have a protein storage unit. All right, I don't know why I put that in there again. Just showing you amino acids break off the amino group that's excreted in urea. All right, so fed state. So the absorptive state, what's called postprandial. And so once someone is eaten, this state lasts for 4 hours after that. So this is when we are actively absorbing our nutrients. And so that's why it's called the absorptive state. Okay, so this is a great, if you're a picture person, look down here. If you're a word person, look up there. So the big thing is that anabolism is going to exceed catabolism because we are now fed. So we are going to take our amino acids from our diet. We're going to make proteins. Excess glucose, we're going to make glycogen. Glycerol and fatty acids, we're going to make triglycerides. The major fuel that's going to be used is going to be dietary glucose. So we're going to just go ahead and catabolize glucose through cellular respiration, get our ATP and our waste products, carbon dioxide, and water. The liver, what it's going to do, amino acids are going to be deaminated, used for energy, and stored as fat. So once that amino acid pool is full and cells are going to take up their amino acids, anything left over is going to be converted, either going to be burned for ATP if there wasn't enough carbohydrates, or it's going to be stored as fat. And so these are the major events of the absorptive or fed state. The hormone that's going to rule the absorptive state is insulin. And so when we have high blood glucose because we've just eaten a meal, those beta cells are going to increase insulin. Its target is going to be the tissues. It's going to facilitate diffusion of glucose into the cells, which once again, they can be used to make energy. If it's going to be an adipocyte, we're going to store that as fatty acids and glycerol, or the liver and skeletal muscles can make glycogen. Also, since we are in the fed state, so go over here, it's going to increase that active transport of amino acids into tissue cells and increase protein synthesis. And this makes sense. So think about being fed like having money. That's when you do your building projects. Also, just keep in mind, we mentioned this before when we talked about insulin. Brain, liver, and kidneys do not need insulin to take up glucose. They can do that on their own. Two, what's also going to happen in this fed state, the liver is not going to go through gluconeogenesis because we have glucose. So that's going to be inhibited. but insulin is going to rule that fed absorptive state. So let's look at homeostatic imbalances. So diabetes mellitus, so diabetes flows through, mellitus means honey, so it's sweet. That is when there's either inadequate insulin production by the pancreas or abnormal insulin receptors. And so the signs of untreated diabetes are the 3 Ps. So polyphagia means increased appetite. That's because that glucose is unavailable to most of the body cells. So we're going to get a stimulus in appetite. Polyuria, so poly means many, so I think many urinations. So high urination, and polydipsia means high thirst. This is because now glucose is high in the blood, and so that's exceeding that transport maximum and renal plasma threshold, so it's in the urine, and so a lot of water is going to be left to osmotic diuresis. And so someone's going to be really, really hungry, they're going to be urinating a lot, and they're going to be super thirsty. Fats and proteins are going to be used for energy instead, so you get lipolysis and ketogenesis, and so you're also going to see ketones in the urine. If it's untreated, then it can lead to metabolic acidosis. Someone has untreated sudden diabetes, they can also lose weight, so protein wasting and weight loss. To be honest, type 2 diabetes comes on slowly. Type 1 can come on rather rapidly, and that usually is going to occur in someone under the age of 30. Oh, there we go. So type 1 diabetes, the difference between type 1 and type 2. So in a nutshell, if type 1 diabetes, the pancreas is incapable of making insulin because it has been destroyed by autoimmune disease. And so here's my little pictures. It shows destruction of those beta cells. So the pancreas cannot make insulin, so that person will be insulin dependent for the rest of their lives. Type 2 diabetes, the pancreas still makes insulin. See, the pancreas is still functioning. What happens is that the cells become insulin resistant, and whether that's a problem, they think it's a problem with the binding or there's a change in that receptor, but type 2 diabetes is linked to obesity, meaning 90% of people with type 2 diabetes are overweight or obese. They also know when people's blood glucose levels start creeping up, if the person loses weight, then their body becomes more insulin sensitive again. So it's sort of reversible to a point. And so type 2 diabetes, their pancreas works, they are insulin resistant. Type 1 diabetes, pancreas doesn't work, nothing wrong with the insulin receptors, but their pancreas, those beta cells have been destroyed by autoimmune response. The third one is gestational diabetes. This one only occurs when a woman is pregnant. And so the pancreas still makes insulin once again, but it's going to be those pregnancy hormones that are making that woman insulin resistant. So it's going to increasing blood glucose levels. What it leads to is an increased birth weight for the baby. Like I said, it does go away once a baby is delivered. A woman that has gestational diabetes, it does increase the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, but due to those hormonal changes. So other homeostatic imbalances. So you can have too much insulin as well, so excessive insulin, that's hyperinsulinism. It causes hypoglycemia. So insulin lowers blood glucose levels, so if you have too much insulin, you can have hypo, low, glucose, glycemia in the blood. And so when that occurs, anxiety, nervousness, disorientation, unconsciousness, even death, or just angry. And so that's going to be treated by sugar ingestion. They're just showing you if you consume a lot of simple sugars, you get a sugar spike. The body responds by secreting too much insulin, and then you get that drop, and then you get that temporary hypoglycemia. So that's what they mean by the crash. All right, so how do you know? A normal blood glucose when someone is fasting is going to be less than 100. And so that's just kind of the number that I want you to remember. So normal blood glucose levels less than 100. If we were in lab, we would be doing this and we would have gotten to measure yours. So I'm terribly sorry. But just kind of remember that less than 100 is that healthy. If someone's creeping up 100 to 125, like I said, that's when someone's pre-diabetic. And if someone is overweight, then they would recommend that they try to lose weight and then come back later and check their blood glucose again. All right, so we have covered that fed absorptive state. So once again, if you need a break, you go ahead and pause me, but I'm going to keep going because we just have this fasting post-absorptive state left. So let's do it. So fasting, so now you are in between meals. You are precisely 4 hours after your meal. So we've already absorbed our nutrients. There's nothing to absorb now, so now it's the post, so after that absorptive state. All right, so what's happening? So in this, in that post-absorptive state, it kind of makes sense. Catabolism is going to exceed anabolism. So now we're going to break things down that we had already stored. So proteins can be broken down to amino acids. Glycogen is going to be broken down to glucose. Triglycerides can be broken down into glycerol, and fatty acids. The major fuels, glucose can be provided by glycogenesis, so we're going to break down that glycogen storehouse and use that. Gluconeogenesis can occur, so the liver can make glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, and then using fatty acids and ketones to make energy, so to make ATP. The liver metabolism, amino acids, like I said, we already said, is converted to glucose, gluconeogenesis. So it goes amino acids, keto acids, and then it can build glucose. That breakdown of fats for energy is called lipolysis. And so, like I said, that ketogenesis, formation of ketone bodies from fatty acids for energy. Fatty acids cannot be used in gluconeogenesis, but they can be used to make ketones, which then enter the citric acid cycle. And so that's why this says fatty acids can then be burned, and you don't see fatty acids being converted to glucose. That's just all that was. So you get glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, lipolysis, and ketogenesis are all things that are going to occur in that post-absorptive state, because the goal is to maintain blood glucose levels between meals. Yep, and that's just showing you that magical organ, the liver, is responsible for all of that. And so this is what they mean by blood glucose is going to go to your brain, because your brain likes glucose. After, once the glucose runs out, if someone's in starvation, it can convert to use ketone bodies. All right. So the hormone that's going to rule that post-absorptive state is glucagon, because the glucose is gone. So low plasma glucose is going to stimulate those alpha cells to release glucagon. Glucagon is going to stimulate that glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. That is going to raise blood glucose levels. And then to insulin and glucagon are antagonistic. So once glucose goes up, we also get insulin. We're also going to stimulate fat. We're also going to stimulate fat breakdown, which is called lipolysis. So it's going to increase plasma fatty acids, and fats are used by certain tissues for glucose sparing. So the heart is a big one that can use fats, glucose sparing. All right, so that glucose sparing, let's talk about it a little bit more. So that saves glucose for the organs that need it the most. So brain, red blood cells can only use glucose. During prolonged periods of fasting, the body uses more non-carbohydrate sources to conserve that glucose. The brain's going to use the bulk of it, but it can switch about 3 to 5 days without food. The brain can start to use those ketone bodies as a fuel source. Other body cells can switch a little easier than the brain. The amount of fat in a body is going to determine how long a person can survive without food. Like I said, you get those ketone bodies, and then you could get ketonuria, so ketones in the urine. All right, so hopefully you got all that from that. Let me see. Ketogenesis, gluconeogenesis, prolonged fasting, days. Yeah. Okay, cellular. When someone fasts, that's when they're going to start breaking down their proteins, and that protein is the last resort. Your body doesn't like wasting. Okay, so hopefully now this picture hopefully makes sense to you. So catch-all figure, hopefully you see the breakdown products and end products of digestion. So carbohydrates, we're going to get glucose. Proteins will get amino acids, fats are going to get glycerol and fatty acids. Highest energy per pound, that's going to be your fats. Which are stored and how? So triglycerides, long-term energy storage. Glucose can be stored as glycogen in liver and skeletal muscle, or it can be converted to fat. Proteins, excess amino acids are converted to glucose or fat by the liver. They are not stored. Which are for energy and which are more for building blocks. Carbs and fats are more for energy, and amino acids are more for building blocks. And which conditions lead to metabolic acidosis? I corrected it on your notes, but basically untreated diabetes. Fasting is going to lead to formation of ketone bodies, so ketosis. You can get ketonuria, but that metabolic acidosis, that is when diabetes is untreated. All right. That's it. Enjoy your day. That wraps up nutrition and metabolism.